ladies and gentlemen. I'd like to welcome you to this second session of the South Center Conference on the global economy. The theme of this session is how a new global downturn might affect developing countries and what could be done to mitigate possible effects. We have a very distinguished panel. We have Mr. Rubens Ricupero. We have who is former Secretary General of UNCTAD, no stranger to this room or to building, scholar, statesman, diplomat. Charles Soludo, who is a member of the board of the South Center and former governor of the Central Bank of Nigeria. Nagesh Kumar, who is the chief economist at the UN SCAP in Bangkok, now in Delhi. Mr. Lidma Hui, who is the economic advisor to the South Center and is also at the Ministerial Council of Penang, Malaysia. And Mr. Alfredo Calcano, who is the head of the Macroeconomic and Development Policies branch in the Globalization and Development Strategies Division of UNCTAD. We are already 15 minutes late from the time that we were scheduled to start, and therefore I will begin without any further ado. May I invite Mr. Rubens Ricupero to make his presentation.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen. I was asked by Martin Core to talk not so much about the subject of the title of this session, because this will be addressed by my colleagues, but more on the question of the future of the world trading system, particularly in the light of the current stalemate in the Doha Round negotiations. I will try to do so asking you, first of all, to keep in mind that nothing of what I will say should be misconstrued as an expression of the loss of faith in the world trading system. I say this because although I'm no longer in a position, an official position, I've been a victim of many misunderstandings because of trying to speak my mind perhaps too freely and hurting feelings of people who didn't get my message in a correct way. So I want to start by stating very strongly that I'm a firm believer in the need for a rules-based trading system. I do believe that developing countries need this system as much as the others, perhaps even more, because of their differential of power. But I also believe that we are still far from the goal of building an effective link between trade and development, that there is much to be done in that subject before we can feel satisfied that we have reached our ultimate objective. Having said so, I must tell you that it is with great humility that I approach the subject now, because for years I've been out of touch with daily negotiations in WTO, so there is nothing really that I could tell you that you don't know much better knowing the subject on a familiar basis. I tried to follow the discussions of the 8th Ministerial WTO Conference as well as I could, and I also read the reports about the recent Davos discussion. And I must say that particularly Davos left me with an impression of a déjà vu. That is, most of what was said regarding trade was the repetition of a very old and failed attempts in similar circumstances in the past. For instance, the idea that we should try a new approach, perhaps on a plurilateral, not on a binding multilateral basis, the idea that people should drop the common single understanding, although I myself have many doubts about the wisdom of the single undertaking in the Uruguay round, it is curious that only now this approach is beginning to be questioned. It's interesting because not long ago I was reading a lecture by Martin Wolf on the future. Not on the future, the lecture was called, "Does the world trading system have a future?" with a question mark. And Patrick Messerlin, who was one of his commentators, at a point quoted the discussion about the single undertaking, and he said, it's not me, he said that the single undertaking had been a trap for recalcitrant developing countries in 1995. And that has always been my firm belief. But it's now Mr. Patrick Messerlin who says that, apparently in an approving way. It was not my own approach to the matter. But it's interesting that now the single undertaking has been questioned, and people are again talking about increasing the proliferation of regional or sub-regional agreements, even coming back from the kingdom of dead, some very old ideas like the free trade agreement between the United States and Europe, the North Atlantic free trade pact that has been discussed for 50 years now, on and off. I remember when Gary C. Hufbauer wrote his famous essay in the 1990s about the OECD free trade area for goods, services, and investment that was supposed to come into effect on the 1st of January of the year 2000. We are now on January of 2012. So there have been many old ideas that are now being again discussed. And what I could say in the light of my previous experience is that they won't fly. They are not serious. They lack any internal coherence. They lack the basis to provide a new impetus to negotiations. In Davos, Pascal Lamy was quoted as saying that the main problem of the current negotiations is that political will has become a very scarce commodity. There is no political will, and he said this applies not only to trade negotiations, but to climate change negotiations, to currency arrangements, and I would add to financial reform as well. We are going through a period where there is no political will to tackle the difficult and the structural problems of the world economy. But why is it so? Of course, it would take us long to go over all the factors that may explain this situation. But I would just remind you that we are still in the middle not only of the worst financial and economic crisis in over 70 years, and of course that crises are not conducive to deep reform, because when you have to fight a fire, your priority is first and foremost to put down the fire and not to rebuild your house. But not only this, but this crisis coincides with something much deeper and much more important. As you know, as the late French historian Fernand Braudel would say, crises are conjectural. They are of a conjuncture. They are of a midterm in terms of a period of time, whereas there are secular trends that will last for decades and decades. And what we are facing now is the coincidence of an economic crisis in this middle level period with a tremendous shift in the international division of labor, one of those rare events, perhaps once in every 100 or 120 years, when the balance of the division of labor changes. We are witnessing this derivation of the axis of economic power, of demographics towards Asia, and all this is creating an enormous amount of insecurity. All this is affecting deeply the comparative advantages of countries. People are questioning whether the country in 20 years or in 30 years will still have any industry left. So in this kind of atmosphere, it would be a fantasy to pretend that we can go into radical reform of the rules. We have to admit that rule-making needs a favorable atmosphere to build a consensus. We all know that in the field of law, we are only able to build a new law when social relations have stabilized in that field. We can't do it whereas we are still going through a process of continuous change. And this is why I must say I've always thought it was unwise to launch a round at this period. When I started, I told you that I have a longer history of being misunderstood. And one of the occasions where I was terribly misunderstood, and I think many of my friends in WTO still hold a deep grudge against me because of that, it was years ago in the debate in Chatham House, where Dr. Supachai was at my side. He was the DG of WTO at the time. And I had the lack of prudence, of saying that, in my opinion, the Doha round was one round too much, one round too early. That is, after the Uruguay round, we should have provided the countries the time to digest, to implement, to apply the rules, to gauge the new situation. But there was a rush towards a new round, not because there was a demand of the world population, but a single entity. At that time, this entity was called Sir Leon Brittan, wanted to have the Millennium Round. Nobody else, not even the Americans want the round, you know. I've been present for most of my life to all ministerial meetings of the old GATT and WTO until 2004, 2005. And I was present in Singapore in the first ministerial meeting when Sir Leon made his plea about a millennium round, and he was followed in the podium by the lady who was then the USTR, and she said, no way, we are totally satisfied with the Uruguay round. We got intellectual property, the TRIPS agreement, we got TRIMS, we got services. Now we are getting here in Singapore the ITA, you remember, the Information Technology Agreement. In Geneva, we are going to conclude in a few months the Basic Telecommunications Agreement and the Basic Financial Services Agreement. Why should we have a new round? At the time, that was the feeling, you know. But with the political events in 2001, in September, the mood changed, and finally the round was launched. I was also there. I was also present at the creation in Doha. And in effect, I had to speak on behalf of Kofi Annan. And I said, I will only call this round a development round because I'm speaking on behalf of Kofi Annan. On my own behalf, I would never call it a development round, not because I doubt that it could evolve into a developing round, but you can't say that beforehand. You have to be sure that it will be a development round, that it will deliver the goods. No? And what we saw was that, unfortunately, it was not meant seriously. I wonder if Monsieur Patrick Messerlin would call also a trap. It's a trap for developing countries. I don't know. But the fact is that we launched something for which there was no real demandeurs. And one of the explanations of the current stalemate we have been seeing now is that there is no sufficient input and push and drive from the business community in the traditionally trade demandeur countries. So what should be done? And I will conclude because I don't want to go much beyond my time. I think that in times like ours, we should not despair. We should not say that the WTO is not going to survive. No, I think WTO was a conquest. I myself was part of the negotiators in the Uruguay round who set up WTO. I believe it will survive, and it has a very useful role to play. But we should be realistic in our goals and in our objectives. At the time WTO was concluded, it was fashionable to say that the old trade negotiations that were described as being about shallow integration, that is, tariff reductions, etc., that this age was over, that the work had been concluded, and we should move into the new and promising country of deep integration. That is the challenge of harmonizing domestic standards and norms, all the realm of rules that explain why countries are competitive or not. People really believed in that. My former colleague, my friend Renato Ruggiero, once said that the WTO should become the World Assembly to write the constitution of globalization. He had this idea. You know, those were the dreams of that time. Nowadays, we know how difficult it is to be really effective in deep integration. Even the Europeans, they are not able to agree on adopting a common approach to fiscal matters. Why should the world that is so heterogeneous to harmonize all kinds of rules and standards? So it's clear that this is not the approach. So if this is not the approach, what so? We should have a WTO plus, but not in the sense this word, this expression is commonly used. It should be a WTO plus, not to add new burdens, new challenges to countries that are already struggling to deliver the commitments they made in the past. The WTO Plus should be an organization that would try to apply seriously the old rules that have been abandoned before adding new ones. Because the fact is that the world trading system has been corroded by many exceptions in agriculture, in textiles, in many, many areas. And we have a debt. This morning, Mr. Somavia was very eloquent in mentioning the social debt created by structural adjustment. But we should not should not forget that WTO has a heavy debt, which is the unfinished business of the Tokyo Round and the Uruguay Round. When we started the Uruguay Round, we used to speak about the need to complete the unfinished business of the Tokyo Round. And unfortunately, now we have to add the unfinished business of the Uruguay Round. What is this debt? Is first a meaningful liberalization in agriculture. We have done very little. I'm old enough to remember the beginning of the negotiations in the Uruguay Round when President Reagan was in power and his Secretary of Agriculture was a Mr. Lin, and the American proposal was zero in domestic subsidies. It must sound now to the current delegates as something impossible. Zero in domestic subsidies, zero in market, zero in terms of barriers, market barriers, and zero in export subsidies. And we can see how much the position of the leading countries has changed in this respect. So we need to go back to agriculture, not to the zero option, but to something realistic. For instance, it is necessary to stop this trend of increasing more and more the number of green light subsidies in domestic support. We have to deliver meaningful market access in agricultural product, we have to put a final end to any kind of export subsidies in agriculture. And then we have to address, beyond agriculture, the problem of a tariff peaks in a number of important sectors, including in manufacturing sectors. We have to address the problem of a tariff escalation, particularly as they affect developing countries on commodities. We have to address the old issue of anti-dumping, of a countervailing duty. Even Mr. Martin Wolf now says that infant industries in developing countries should be dealt with in a more approachable, a more tolerant way. So we have an enormous amount of work to be done, and it's not a coincidence that those are the issues that would give content to the link between trade and development. So I conclude with those words, you know. The world trading system has a future, it has a promise to deliver, but it should concentrate on building up this link between trade and development, facing once and for all this unfinished business that we have been avoiding over 30 years now. So this is the message I would like to leave delegates here. They should not feel defensive. They should not feel apologetic in saying that we do demand what is due to us, because those matters were left outside the protection of rules because of the waivers that were granted in the late 1950s, in the 1940s, in the early 1950s. So it is a duty to overturn those exceptions and finally deliver a harvest in development results of a trade negotiation. Thank you very much, and my apologies for having been carried away by this. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Ricupero, for your succinct exposition and robust skepticism about the necessity and wisdom of further rounds of multilateral trade negotiations, even more attempting to focus on what the multilateral trading system should be in an ideal world so that it is conducive to development, and what the WTO should be. I would say not WTO plus, but WTO minus.
No, it is plus. It is plus. That is to apply the old rules that are not being applied.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you so much. I think what you have said sets the stage to perfection for the session tomorrow morning, when we are going to have our ambassadors in the WTO speak from their national perspectives. We now move to considering how the global downturn might affect the developing world and how developing countries could address its consequences from different regional perspectives. So may I now invite Dr. Charles Saludo to address this question from an African perspective.
Okay. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. The topic is quite a big question, and actually, as I just continue to reflect on the topic, I ask myself whether anything has actually changed since we last met in May. I think some building discussing this kind of issue. What has changed? New threats have emerged. Thank you. New threats have emerged. They were there then. They have only changed maybe in terms of context. The degree may have changed, but the problems remain. The Eurozone sovereign debt crisis, still persistent. the intensity, and how it might all get resolved, we don't know. The U.S. is still caught in the logjam of its own policies, and it's unlikely to have a leeway until after the general elections. So the U.S. economy is projected to still remain a little bit anemic. The Eurozone crisis, some even project, might get into a deep recession, as it were. And they are now agreeing to a fiscal pact. Let's hope that goes through. But I'm not sure if that is good or bad for the global financial system, because that is a pact that will be, some will say, it's either going to be pro-cyclical in the light of the crisis if it materializes, or in the best case scenario, become acyclical, but not counter-cyclical. But also the result of the 2008-2009 crisis, the accumulated debt because of the stimulus packages simultaneously implemented almost across the entire world, has meant that many governments have now seen themselves saddled with some heavy debt that they consider unsustainable, and therefore the pressure to unwind, and therefore going towards swinging to another pendulum, almost kind of global austerity measures, as it were. Now, if we have this, and in the light of the accumulated debt, one implication is that if another crisis should crystallize, most governments will have fewer space in terms of fiscal policy and monetary policy to pursue the kind of expansionary fiscal and monetary policies that they pursued in the light of the 2008-2009 crisis. And therefore, many people project that the next crisis, if it comes, will actually be more longer lasting and even more severe in terms of impact than the last one. And so the question is, if it does happen, as many see would happen, what will be the effects and how can we mitigate these effects for developing countries, especially for Africa? And let me just put a quick footnote before I get into the question, and that is that as I look at the various projections that have been made by the various institutions, the World Bank, the UN, World Economic Situation and Prospects, the Euro Monitor, the IMF, and so on and so forth, with their latest projections and so on. My first reaction to this, and that is to say, will this happen? Quite frankly, my short answer to it is I don't know. Do I believe many of these projections? I haven't got a strong basis to say no, that I don't believe them, but I have also no strong conviction to believe that they would crystallize as being projected. And one of the things that gave me this impetus is just the past, the history. During the 2008, and I see quite what I might call a dangerous trend that is taking place in the global discourse of the emerging crisis, if it does. And that is, which is characteristic. We swing from one pendulum to the other. Before the 2008-2009 crisis, the Lehman Brothers and so on, and the entire world tumbled upside down. Almost all, there was a consensus of opinion. The major economic policy institutions in the World Bank, the IMF, the UN, everybody, the projections were benign in terms of, it will soon peter out. It was a liquidity squeeze. It will soon peter out. The effects weren't going to be much. All the World Bank projections, everything, nobody ever saw the nature or the magnitude of the crisis that eventually came. Now, I just participated recently in evaluating a member of the external advisory group on the surveillance, the IMF triennial surveillance. And one issue that came up very strongly was how everybody got it wrong the last time. And there was lack of candor. Nobody, we're not forthright in saying it as it is, and so on. What I see as a danger now is that as a consequence of that lesson, everybody is swinging to the next, and there's now a competition as to who might be the most alarmist in projecting the next one. If you see the current world, the global economic prospects, they use the word dangerous. You turn to the IMF thing, the world is turning to a dangerous time. So everybody is now competing as to who will be most candid in projecting the next Armageddon that is going to befall us. And that is why I say we need to be cautious in looking at this number. And as I look at the various projections as to how this will impact on the global economy and the developing countries, you don't really get that. First of all, they're as varied as the different projections come, which is expected. Some project, Euromonitor projects about 3.8% GDP growth for the world. The other one projects 3.5 or 2.5 or 2 point this, and depending as the case may be. But when it comes to developing countries, they all project anything between about 5 to almost 6, approximately, for developing countries. And you look at it relative to trend in the last 1 or 2 years, not quite a significant change. So if you want to get one message from it, from all if the projections are to be relied upon, they're basically saying there won't be a significant change from trend in terms of impacts on developing countries. But whether that will go back to the pre-2008 crisis, which is the aspiration, okay, of course, relative to that trend, is significant in impact. On Africa, the worst-case scenario projection I have seen is that by the Global Economic Prospects of the World Bank, which projects about 5.3% for sub-Saharan Africa. And the worst-case scenario that it says is the possibility of losing another 1.3%, which will get it to about 4% still generally, which you might say, well, relative to the rest of the world, not too badly, but relative to the pre-crisis trend, might be bad. And these impacts traditionally get onto Africa and many other developing countries through the traditional channels we know, through trade, as Yilmaz pointed out in the morning. The business cycles are synchronized, across regions and across countries. The downturn in Europe will obviously have ripple effects on other countries, as the case may be, through trade, through commodity prices, aid flows to Africa, for example, remittances, FDI and portfolio flows, and counterparty risks, and so on and so forth. The channels are quite very well known in terms of the possibilities of how they would could possibly impact or have ripple effects on Africa. Mr. Chair, when it comes to what is it that can possibly be done, this is where I'm a little bit, I know it's usual now in these conferences who just retort the same thing. Government should do this, government should do this, government should do this. But for me, sitting where I do and being part of this debate from the 80s, the SAP, the Lagos Plan of Action, the AFSAP, down till date, you kind of ask yourself, what is it new that we're going to be saying other than just to say you are your own, basically? I'm reminded of, is that an oracle that the people, the village would often go to consult anytime they have a problem. And they came the first time, the first year, the oracle told them what to do. They went back, they did little or none of them. The next year they had another problem, they went back. The third year they went back and the oracle said, have you done the ones I told you 2 years ago? I said, no. I said, go and do them. Why? The next one won't make any difference. And for much of what we're saying, in terms of the way to react, it's not for lack of knowledge or a pool of knowledge as to what to be done as part of the Cant Africa Claim the 21st Century. You go back in time to all the magnitude of compendium of plans, various plans, even the recent one of the Stiglitz report on how developing countries and the world should react to this crisis. It's not for lack of proposals or ideas or programs as to best where, including what the chairman himself talked about this morning, the heterodox program of action, which basically says you are on your own, and each country is different. Therefore, my first message here is that there is unlikely to be, quote, an African impact that will be in Africa, because there will be different countries, and there will also be unlikely to be the African response. The impact will differ from country to country, and the responses will also differ from country to country. Several African countries, some are more tied to Europe than the other. Some have higher levels of remittances from Europe than the others. Some have higher aid flows from Europe than the others. Some have greater trade ties with Europe than the others. And so it will just depend. The multilateral work at the level of Africa, the level of the world economy, we are possibly going to have the next crisis because of the failure of the multilateral coordination mechanisms. It is even more so among the developing countries. For Africa, I do not see, even though there will be talk about it, but I don't see anything happening concretely in terms of multilateral coordination on that. And so what I then see is a modeling through approach. Different countries are just basically, everybody is on his own.